9 years. 9 years of silence. No birthday calls, no Christmas cards, not even a text when my daughter was born. My own mother erased me the day I told her I was marrying a black man. She said I was throwing away the family name. She said I would regret it. She said a lot of things standing in that kitchen, and then she picked up her purse and walked out of my life like I was a stranger she'd bumped into on the street. For 9 years, I built a life without her. I healed. I moved on. I told myself I was fine. And then, 3 weeks ago, she showed up on my porch uninvited, unannounced, with a smile plastered on her face like nothing had ever happened. And a request that made my blood run cold. If you've ever had to choose between the family that raised you and the family you built for yourself, stay until the end, because what happened next is going to make you furious, and it's going to make you cheer. My name is Renee, and this is my story. I grew up in a small town outside Charleston, South Carolina, in a house where certain things were simply understood without ever being said out loud. We went to church every Sunday. We had Sunday dinners at 4 o'clock sharp. And we did not, under any circumstances, mix. That word, mix, I heard it my whole childhood, tossed around casually at family barbecues, muttered under my grandmother's breath at the television, dropped like it was as normal as talking about the weather. I didn't understand, when I was young, how much that one ugly little word was going to define the next decade of my life. My father, Walter, was a quiet man who mostly let my mother, Diane, run the household. And Diane ran it like a general runs an army, with rules, expectations, and consequences for anyone who stepped out of line. I was the oldest of 3, the one who was supposed to set the example. Go to a good college. Marry a good man, meaning, in my mother's world, a white man from a good family with a respectable last name. Have 2 children. Attend the same church she attended. Live, essentially, a carbon copy of her life. For 24 years, I did everything right. I got my degree in early childhood education. I taught 3rd grade in the town over. I dated men my mother approved of, men who bored me to tears, men who my mother would light up around like they were visiting royalty. And then I met Marcus. I was 25, at a teaching conference in Atlanta, sitting alone at a hotel bar because my roommate had ditched me for a phone call with her boyfriend. Marcus sat 2 stools down, laughing at something on his phone, and when he caught me watching, he didn't look away, he smiled and said, "You look like you need someone to laugh with you." That was it. That was the whole opening line. And somehow it worked, because 4 hours later we were still talking, and I had completely lost track of the conference schedule I was supposed to follow the next morning. Marcus was a structural engineer from Atlanta. He was funny and steady and kind in a way that felt different from every man I had dated before, kind without needing credit for it. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered small things I mentioned once, weeks later. By the time I flew home, I already knew. I just didn't know yet what it was going to cost me. We dated long distance for a year. I told my mother about him early, not because I was naive, but because I was hopeful. I actually believed that if she just met him, if she just saw how good he was to me, it would matter more than the color of his skin. I was wrong. The first time I brought Marcus home for Sunday dinner, my mother was polite in the way you're polite to a salesman you have no intention of buying from. Thin smiles. Short answers. She complimented his shirt, and then spent the rest of dinner asking him questions that sounded more like an interrogation than a conversation. Where exactly he grew up, what his father did for work, whether his family had a history in the state. I felt the temperature of the room drop and drop and drop, and Marcus, to his credit, answered every question with grace, even as I watched the corner of his jaw tighten. After he left that night, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table I'd eaten breakfast at every day of my childhood, and told me, in a voice so calm it was almost worse than if she'd screamed, that this wasn't who we were. That people would talk. That my grandmother would be humiliated. That I was being selfish, chasing some fantasy instead of thinking about what I owed my family. I told her I loved him. She told me love wasn't the point. The engagement happened 8 months later, on a Saturday morning on the porch of Marcus's childhood home, surrounded by his mother, his sisters, and an aunt who cried so hard she had to sit down. It was the opposite of everything I had grown up with: loud, warm, immediate. His family didn't just accept me. They folded me in like I had always belonged there. I drove home that night with the ring on my finger and my chest full of something I hadn't felt in years: pure, uncomplicated happiness. I called my mother from the car. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then she said one sentence I will never forget as long as I live. "If you marry that man, you're no longer my daughter." I laughed at first, because it sounded like something out of a bad movie, the kind of line no real parent actually says out loud to their real child. But she wasn't joking. She hung up before I could respond, and when I called back, it went straight to voicemail. It stayed that way for 3 days. When she finally called back, it wasn't to apologize. It was to tell me she'd spoken with my father, my sister, and my brother, and that the family had made a decision: if I went through with the wedding, none of them would attend, and I should not expect to be welcome in her home again. I want to be honest with you. Some part of me thought it was a threat, not a promise. I thought that when the wedding invitations went out, something would soften. I thought when they saw the venue, the flowers, the dress, some maternal instinct would kick in and she would show up anyway, quietly, in the back row, unable to stay away from her own daughter's wedding. She didn't come. None of them did. I got married on a warm October afternoon in Marcus's family's backyard, surrounded by people who chose to be there. My father-in-law walked me down the aisle because my own father wouldn't. Marcus's mother cried happy tears while my own mother sat 40 minutes away in the house I grew up in, pretending I didn't exist. That was the last contact I had with my mother for 9 years. I won't pretend those first couple of years weren't hard. Grief is a strange thing when the person you're grieving is still alive. I would see mothers and daughters shopping together, laughing over lunch, and feel a hollow ache in my chest that never fully went away. I sent one letter, about 8 months after the wedding, just to say I still loved her, that the door was still open. She never wrote back. But here's the thing about being cut off from people who only loved you conditionally: eventually, if you're lucky, you find out what unconditional actually feels like. Marcus and I built something real. We moved to Atlanta to be closer to his family, and his mother, a woman named Estelle, who I now call Mama E, became more of a mother to me in a single year than my own mother had been in the years leading up to my wedding. She taught me to cook her mother's gumbo recipe. She sat with me on my worst nights when the ache of being disowned would hit out of nowhere, usually around the holidays, and she never once tried to talk me out of missing my own family. She just let me feel it. I went back to school and became a school counselor, something I'd always wanted to do but never pursued because it wasn't practical in my mother's eyes. Marcus climbed steadily at his engineering firm, and within a few years, we bought our first home, a small brick house with a wraparound porch, the kind of house I used to draw as a little girl without knowing why it felt so important. We had our daughter, Maya, in year 4. Then our son, Elijah, 2 years after that. I sent my mother a photo of Maya once, right after she was born, through a cousin who still spoke to both of us. I never got a response. I stopped trying after that. By year 9, we weren't just surviving. We were thriving. Marcus had been promoted to lead structural engineer on major commercial projects across the Southeast. I'd been named lead counselor at my school district and had started doing private consulting on the side, helping families navigate exactly the kind of estrangement I knew far too well. Our home was paid off 2 years early. Our kids were happy, healthy, loved beyond measure by an entire extended family that had never once questioned whether they belonged. I had built, from nothing, the life my mother told me I would regret. I did not regret a single day of it. It was a Tuesday evening in early spring. Marcus was working late on a project deadline. The kids were doing homework at the kitchen table while I made dinner, half listening to Maya explain, at great length, why her math teacher was definitely wrong about long division. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. We lived on a quiet cul-de-sac where neighbors texted before they came by, so my first thought was that it might be a delivery. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door. My mother was standing on my porch. I hadn't seen her in 9 years. Her hair, once a deep brown she colored religiously every 6 weeks, was fully gray now, cut short in a style I didn't recognize. She looked smaller than I remembered, not just older, but somehow diminished, like the years had worn down whatever certainty used to hold her shoulders so straight. For a moment neither of us said anything. I heard Maya's voice behind me, asking who was at the door, and I told her, without turning around, to go finish her homework with her brother. My mother's eyes moved past me into the house, and I watched something flicker across her face, maybe surprise, maybe something closer to longing before she caught herself and smoothed her expression back into something more composed. "Renee," she said, like my name was something she'd been rehearsing in the car. "You look well." I didn't invite her in. "What are you doing here?" She smiled, that same thin, practiced smile from that first Sunday dinner all those years ago. "Can't a mother visit her daughter?" I almost laughed. 9 years of silence, and she wanted me to believe this was a spontaneous visit, a mother simply overcome with the urge to reconnect. I stood in the doorway with my arms crossed, waiting for her to either explain herself or leave, and after a long, uncomfortable pause, she finally dropped the act. "I need to talk to you about your father," she said. "He's sick, Renee. It's his heart. The doctors say he doesn't have long." I felt the ground tilt slightly beneath me. Whatever I expected, an apology, an attempt at reconciliation, even more of the same coldness, it wasn't this. "How sick?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "Months, maybe. Not years." She let that sit for a moment, watching my face carefully, and something about the way she watched me, clinical, calculating, made the sympathy I'd started to feel curdle into suspicion. "Why are you telling me this now and not 9 years ago?" Her jaw tightened. "Because your father wants to see his grandchildren before he dies." I let her inside. I told myself it was because of my father, because whatever had happened between my mother and me, he was still my father. And the thought of him dying without ever meeting Maya and Elijah cracked something open in my chest that 9 years of resentment hadn't fully sealed. We sat in the living room. She looked around at the photographs on the walls, my wedding day, Marcus's family reunions, Maya's first day of kindergarten, Elijah's baseball games, and I watched her study each one like she was cataloging everything she'd missed, everything she'd chosen to miss. "You've done well for yourself," she said finally. "We have," I said. "Marcus has done well for us." She flinched slightly at his name, and I felt my patience thinning again. "You said Dad wants to see the kids. What does that actually mean? You want to visit? You want us to come there?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation, I finally understood why she was really there. "Your father's medical bills," she said, "they're significant. The insurance doesn't cover everything, and with his condition, there's a treatment, experimental, but promising, that isn't covered at all. We've looked at everything. We took a second mortgage. We're still short." There it was. "How short?" $60,000. I sat back on the couch, letting the number settle over the room like a fog. $60,000. 9 years of silence, and she'd found her way to my door with a number. "And you thought," I said slowly, "that after 9 years of pretending I don't exist, I'd just write you a check." "You're my daughter," she said, and for the first time, her voice cracked slightly, whether from genuine emotion or practiced performance, I honestly couldn't tell anymore. "Family helps family." "Family," I repeated. "You mean like how you helped me when I got married? When my daughter was born? When I sent you a photo of my newborn and you didn't even respond?" Her face hardened. "That was different." "How was that different?" "You made a choice that hurt this family, Renee. You knew what it would mean." And there it was 9 years later, and she still couldn't say his name. She still couldn't acknowledge that the choice she was referring to was marrying a good man who loved me completely, a man who had built me a life she now sat inside of, admiring the photographs on the wall, without a shred of self-awareness about the irony. "Let me make sure I understand," I said. You disowned me for marrying Marcus. You missed my wedding. You've never met your grandchildren. You didn't respond to a single letter, a single photo in 9 years. And now you're here, in my house, that Marcus and I built together, using my father's illness to ask me for $60,000. She didn't deny a single word of it. I'm not asking for myself, she said instead. This is for your father. Do you want him to die knowing his daughter refused to help him? I felt something in my chest go cold and very, very still. I told her I needed to think, which was mostly true, and mostly a way of getting her out of my house before Marcus came home, and had to see her sitting on our couch after everything. I told her I'd call her within the week. She left with a hopeful smile that made my skin crawl, like she already believed she'd won. That night, after the kids were asleep, I told Marcus everything. He listened without interrupting, the way he always does, his jaw tightening slightly at the parts about the photographs, about the insult of her sitting in our home judging the life we'd built while asking us to fund it. What do you want to do? He asked when I finished. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to help. He's still my father. He never said those things to me directly, it was always her. Part of me feels sick that she'd use his illness like a bargaining chip. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Do you actually believe he's sick? The question stopped me cold, because somewhere underneath everything, I hadn't actually questioned it. I'd taken it at face value, the same way I used to take everything my mother said at face value, right up until the moment she told me I was no longer her daughter. The next morning, I called my sister, Kayla. We hadn't spoken much since the wedding either, though she'd never fully cut me off the way our mother had, just drifted, the way people do when maintaining a relationship becomes politically inconvenient. I asked her directly, was Dad sick? There was a long pause on the line. Renee, she said slowly, Dad had a mild heart scare 2 years ago. He's on medication. He's fine. Better than fine. Actually, he retired last year and spends most of his time fishing. I sat down at my kitchen table, my whole body suddenly very heavy. She told me he's dying. She asked me for $60,000 for experimental treatment. Kayla went quiet again, and then she said something that confirmed everything I'd already started to suspect. Mom and Dad refinanced the house last year to cover Marcus Jr.'s, she caught herself, sorry, our cousin's legal fees. He got into some trouble. They're behind on payments. I didn't know she'd go to you about it. I didn't know she'd use Dad like that. There it was. Not a dying father. Not an experimental treatment. A manufactured crisis, dressed up in just enough truth, my father's real, though mild and managed, heart condition, to make the lie believable to the one daughter she assumed was desperate enough for reconciliation to stop asking questions. I called my mother back 3 days later, not to give her a check, but to give her something she clearly wasn't expecting, the truth, laid out plainly, without anger, without tears, without giving her the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I spoke to Kayla, I said. Dad's fine. There's no experimental treatment. There's a refinanced house and legal fees for a cousin I haven't spoken to in a decade. The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. You lied to me, I continued. You showed up at my house, looked at photos of my children, children you've never met, children you chose not to know, and you lied about my father's health to get money out of me. It's not that simple, she started, but I cut her off. It's actually very simple. You spent 9 years deciding I wasn't your daughter because I married a black man. And the first time you needed something from me, you decided I was your daughter again, just long enough to ask for $60,000. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. I don't need to understand it, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. It's not my pressure to carry. You made your choice 9 years ago. You chose your pride over your daughter. You chose what people at church would think over your own grandchildren. And now you want to choose me again, but only as a solution to a financial problem you created. She tried a different approach then, softer, wounded. I've missed you, Renee. Every single day. And maybe some part of that was even true. But I'd learned something in those 9 years, something I now spend my career teaching other people who've survived exactly this kind of conditional love. Missing someone and respecting someone are not the same thing. She hadn't missed the daughter I actually was. She'd missed the daughter she wished I'd stayed compliant, convenient, willing to fold herself into whatever shape kept the family respectable. I hope Dad's okay, I told her. I mean that. But I'm not giving you $60,000, and I'm not doing it because I'm cruel. I'm not doing it because for the first time in 9 years, I'm choosing myself, the way you taught me you would always choose yourself over me. I did reach out to my father directly, through a private message, separate from my mother entirely. He responded within an hour, something that told me he hadn't been part of orchestrating the lie, or at least hadn't known the full extent of it. We talked for the first time in 9 years, carefully, tentatively, like two people relearning a language they used to be fluent in. He told me he'd wanted to reach out for years, but was afraid of what my mother would do if he did. He told me he'd seen photos of Maya and Elijah on Kayla's phone and had cried in his truck afterward, alone, because he didn't know how to fix what had been broken. He apologized, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, in the halting way of a man who has spent decades letting someone else make his decisions for him. We're still rebuilding that relationship slowly. He's met Elijah once, on neutral ground, at a diner 2 hours from where I grew up. Maya isn't ready yet, and I'm not pushing her. He understands why. As for my mother, I haven't spoken to her since that phone call. I heard through Kayla that she was furious I'd humiliated her by refusing, that she told anyone who would listen that I was selfish, ungrateful, that marrying Marcus had changed me, made me hard. She's right about one thing. Marrying Marcus did change me. It taught me what it feels like to be loved without conditions, without a price tag, without a list of requirements I had to meet to earn a place at the table. And once you've tasted that kind of love, you stop being willing to settle for anything less, even from the woman who gave birth to you. My father is doing well, by the way. His heart is stable. There was never any experimental treatment, never any $60,000 needed to save his life. Just a woman who's spent 9 years punishing her daughter for loving the wrong man, and who, when she finally needed something, thought that daughter would still be desperate enough to buy her way back into a family that never really wanted her, just her money. She was wrong. I built a family. A real one. Marcus, Maya, Elijah, Mama E, an entire extended family that chose me, fully, exactly as I am, exactly who I married. And 9 years later, when my mother finally came looking, she didn't find a desperate daughter aching for approval. She found a woman who had already learned to live beautifully, completely, without her. If you've ever had to walk away from family to protect your peace, I want to hear your story in the comments below. And if this story hit home for you, make sure you subscribe, because next week I'm sharing another story that will leave you speechless.